In the Strait of Hormuz, recognized globally as the world's most critical maritime choke point and arguably the most strategically significant waterway on Earth, carrying approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply through a corridor that compresses to just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, where tankers must maintain tight lanes and container ships follow predictable courses with absolutely no room to improvise or deviate from established traffic patterns, a seemingly routine. Freedom of navigation transit by the USS Gravely, a sophisticated Arleigh Burke-class destroyer maintaining standard speed and posture, with a calm deck and quiet bridge that gave no indication of the events about to unfold, transformed within minutes into a pivotal demonstration of modern naval warfare doctrine and strategic deterrence, when Iranian coastal forces executed what they believed to be a carefully calculated strike designed to test American resolve and response capabilities. An attempt that would instead expose the fundamental reality of contemporary conflict escalation and reveal the dangerous miscalculations inherent in assuming that political restraint, civilian maritime traffic proximity, or geographic compression could create tactical advantage against a military force operating under doctrine where surveillance transitions seamlessly into engagement authority, and where defensive and offensive operations proceed simultaneously rather than sequentially. Under the hard afternoon sun at precisely 5:08 p.m., while civilian tankers loaded with crude oil and container ships carrying international commerce maintained their predictable courses through the rigid separation lanes that govern all traffic through this confined waterway, Iranian surveillance systems positioned along the northern coastline, a sophisticated network of fixed radar sites, mobile tracking units, and electro-optical towers, had been fully awake and actively tracking every single vessel for hours through integrated radar arrays that paint targets by track and speed, electro-optical towers that tag silhouettes against the glare of the afternoon sun, and automatic identification system data fusion that builds comprehensive profiles of every ship's displacement, course, and velocity, all feeding into a live maritime picture transmitted inland to command nodes where American warship movements are not merely observed but logged in detail, modeled through simulation, and rehearsed repeatedly long before the vessels even enter the strait's approaches, creating a level of preparation and tactical awareness that transforms routine transits into opportunities for carefully planned engagement scenarios. What began as routine observation and standard intelligence gathering rapidly hardened and escalated into unmistakable fire control behavior as mobile coastal missile units that had been carefully concealed in terrain features and camouflage positions just minutes earlier suddenly shifted into precise alignment procedures, their radar emitters narrowing their beams from wide-area search patterns to focus tracking modes, their tracking resolution increasing dramatically to lock onto specific targets with the precision necessary for weapon guidance, and their fire control systems transitioning from passive observation to active targeting in ways that definitively cross the critical line between surveillance activities and engagement preparation, a transition that in the compressed timelines and accelerated decision cycles of modern warfare matters far more than the first explosion itself, because it triggers automated defensive responses and pre-authorized retaliation sequences that cascade through network command structures faster than human decision-making can intervene to halt or modify them. Within this compressed and constrained battle space where maneuver room for large vessels shrinks to mere minutes and degrees of turn, where dense civilian traffic multiplies potential sensor targets by dozens and creates engagement complications that must be calculated instantaneously, and where fixed Iranian radar sites strategically embedded into coastal terrain features positioned just 5 to 12 miles from the active shipping lanes are backed by mobile missile units, specifically designed and trained to relocate to new firing positions in under 30 minutes to avoid counterfire. The Iranian military doctrine of deliberately exploiting geometric compression through high-volume attacks, employing multiple launch points that create overlapping missile vectors and flight times measured in tens of seconds rather than minutes, appeared on paper to offer significant tactical advantage based on fundamental assumptions that American political restraint regarding civilian casualties, the physical proximity of hundreds of neutral merchant vessels, and the international sensitivity of conducting combat operations in such a critical economic choke point would inevitably slow American response times, even if only briefly, creating windows of opportunity that could be exploited. However, when 24 anti-ship missiles climbed out over the water on carefully calculated converging vectors, all directed toward the Gravely as their single designated target in a near-simultaneous launch sequence from multiple coastal positions specifically choreographed to compress engagement timelines to mere seconds and create the kind of saturation attack scenario that shore-based forces believe gives them advantage. The Iranian attackers fundamentally and catastrophically misunderstood that. Geographic and temporal compression works both ways in modern network warfare because the very same electronic signatures and observable behaviors that enable their coordinated attack. Radar beams narrowing from search mode to targeting mode, fire control emitters spiking in power and frequency as they locked onto their target, mobile launchers pausing their movement to stabilize and align for accurate firing solutions, stood out immediately and unmistakably across a sophisticated, multi-layered sensor network that had already been watching the Hormuz Strait for hours, if not days, a network where individual radar tracks were being confirmed and cross-referenced across several independent sensor axes in real time, where engagement queues were populating automatically in combat information centers even before the first missiles left their launch rails, and where the transition from passive observation to active targeting by Iranian forces was detected, classified, and transmitted to decision-makers with sufficient warning time that defensive and offensive responses could be initiated not after missiles were airborne, but during the final moments of launch preparation itself. The American response demonstrated with surgical precision that modern naval warfare doctrine no longer follows a traditional sequence of waiting for incoming weapons to impact before initiating counterstrikes. As the USS Gravely immediately ceased functioning as an isolated individual hull operating independently, and instead became a critical node inside a sophisticated layered defensive architecture specifically designed and tested for defeating saturation attacks, with the Aegis Combat System, one of the most advanced integrated weapon systems ever deployed, accelerated its processing cycles to update tracking data on inbound threats at intervals measured in fractions of seconds rather than whole seconds, automatically classifying each of the 24 inbound missiles by their speed profiles, altitude trajectories, and secret behavior patterns to determine threat priority and optimal engagement strategies, while simultaneously the first American response came not from launching interceptor missiles, but from electronic warfare systems activating across multiple electromagnetic spectrum bands to inject carefully calibrated distortion and noise into the guidance data links between Iranian command centers and the missiles themselves, and to degrade the confidence and accuracy of the missile's terminal guidance seekers. A critical electronic attack step that defense analysts examining the engagement data later estimated reduced the effective hit probability of the incoming missile salvo by approximately 30 to 40% before any physical defensive missiles ever fired, forcing several missiles to drift away from their optimal intercept geometry and lose track of their intended target. As distances collapsed below 20 miles and missiles accelerated toward their terminal attack phase, sophisticated interceptor missiles launched from vertical launch cells positioned throughout the ship's superstructure in carefully calculated staggered sequences rather than wasteful simultaneous volleys. A deliberate firing pattern designed to preserve precious magazine depth and ammunition reserves while maintaining continuous defensive coverage across the multiple approach axes from which threats were arriving, all controlled through engagement logic software that intelligently avoided redundancy by assigning single interceptors to threats where possible based on calculated intercept probabilities, and only doubling interceptor assignments when confidence levels drop below carefully preset thresholds that balance ammunition conservation against defensive certainty, followed immediately by inner defensive layers transitioning to full combat readiness status with high agility. Short-range missiles aligning their seekers for close-in intercepts inside the critical 10-mile range, where reaction times compress to seconds and targeting solutions must be calculated and executed almost instantaneously, while simultaneously the ship's close-in weapon systems, rapid-fire guns designed as a last line of defense, rotated their barrels into firing arcs measured not in minutes but in seconds, their autonomous fire control loops engaging threats without requiring human authorization or delay to absorb and destroy any missiles that leak through the outer defensive layers, methodically and systematically reducing the threat. Throughout the entire duration of this intense multi-layered engagement, remarkably and demonstrating extraordinary discipline under fire, the Gravely maintained its steady course at standard transit speed, deliberately constrained by the presence of civilian merchant traffic, including oil tankers and container ships within visual range on both sides of the vessel, executing absolutely no sharp evasive maneuvers or last-second emergency turns that might have created momentary confusion for incoming missile guidance systems, but would also have risked catastrophic collisions with neutral civilian vessels operating in confined waters, thereby denying the Iranian attackers the very chaos, disorder, and panic that their saturation attack doctrine specifically relies upon to overwhelm defensive systems by responding instead with calm predictability enforced through rigorous training discipline and pre-planned engagement sequences, systematically reducing the original 24 missile salvo to fewer than half of the initial number, while simultaneously desynchronizing the carefully timed arrival windows the attackers had planned and progressively destabilizing the guidance systems of the surviving missiles through continued electronic warfare attacks. The critical inflection point came not after the defensive battle was won, but during the height of combat itself, as launch signatures, emitter spikes, and command links active during the opening 2 to 3 minutes were already being tagged, time-stamped, and correlated, transforming defensive intelligence into targeting data that propagated outward across secure networks validated not for monitoring but for elimination, because retaliation does not wait for the last intercept in modern American doctrine. Pre-planned strike packages that had existed as contingencies immediately shifted to execution as surface combatants across the region cycled vertical launch systems from standby to active in seconds. Subsurface assets received updated tasking through secure links, and aircraft already airborne were retasked without ever touching a deck, all without emergency meetings or debate, because the decision window had closed the moment hostile intent was confirmed through multiple sensor channels. What followed was not sequential but simultaneous and coordinated, as defensive layers continued suppressing residual inbound threats while the counterstrike unfolded in parallel across multiple military domains, with targeting data gathered during the Iranian launch phase being fused and validated at machine speed to prioritize 11 coastal launch sites, multiple radar nodes, and several mobile command elements for permanent removal rather than mere observation or temporary suppression. The first wave came from U.S. surface combatants strategically positioned across the theater as dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles lifted in rapid sequence from vertical cells, following pre-mapped flight paths to coastal radar installations, fire control nodes, and missile coordination centers, timed to arrive nearly simultaneously and overwhelm any organized defense, with staggered trajectories designed to complicate interception and saturate recovery timelines. As those missiles crossed the coastline and began their terminal attack runs, carrier-based strike aircraft already aloft pushed forward carrying precision-guided munitions and anti-radiation weapons with the priority of achieving blindness rather than spectacle, suppressing radar emitters, severing communications relays, and dismantling air defense coordination points in sequence, while electronic attack aircraft flooded the spectrum to fragment centralized control and force local units to operate on partial information. Below the surface, attack submarines positioned beyond the strait release additional cruise missiles extending the strike deeper inland past the shoreline toward the infrastructure behind it, logistics hubs, command bunkers, and data nodes linking coastal units to higher command, with the objective being systemic severance of the front line from decision-makers entirely. These overlapping waves continued without pause as long-range platforms outside the immediate theater added standoff weapons against hardened sites surviving initial impacts, with updated tasking cycling to the network in near real time to redirect assets based on battle damage indicators, rather than waiting for visual confirmation. Executing not a single strike, but a layered dismantling of capability across domains and distances. By early evening, the measure of outcome was no longer explosions, but silence, as the 11 Iranian launch sites active less than an hour earlier were rendered non-functional. Multiple fire control radars were offline, mobile command nodes were destroyed or abandoned, and reload points were eliminated before they could be used, collapsing not just individual units, but the entire network that had allowed coordination in the first place. Without centralized control, coastal coverage fractured into isolated pockets operating on partial data and delayed queues, with units that once synchronized launches across multiple axes reduced to local actors reacting late and without confidence. eliminating entirely the ability to generate a second salvo not because of restraint, but because the architecture required to do so no longer existed as a functioning system. The effects rippled outward immediately as commercial traffic adjusted, risk models repriced, and tankers slowed or held position not because the strait was closed, but because the credibility and control over it had fundamentally changed, while surveillance intensified across the region to ensure any attempt to rebuild would unfold under persistent observation, turning what was once leverage into permanent exposure. This sequence of events, from initial surveillance detection through defensive engagement to offensive counterstrike, revealed with stark clarity the structural reality and fundamental operating principles of modern naval warfare. In the 21st century, a warship operating in geographically confined waters is not an isolated target operating on its own independent timeline that can be engaged with impunity, but rather functions as a trigger mechanism inside a vast network system specifically, designed and continuously refined to respond faster than human-directed escalation can be managed or controlled. Where once targeting behavior is confirmed through multiple independent sensor sources, the ultimate outcomes are no longer shaped by diplomatic signaling, political rhetoric, or hopes for any restraint, but instead by cold execution through compressed timelines measured in seconds, automated authority delegated to combat systems, and preloaded operational plans built explicitly for permanence rather than temporary tactical advantage, establish the inviolable principle that there is no such thing as a limited strike or warning shot against a modern U.S. Navy warship. There exists only restraint and de-escalation on one hand, or irreversible strategic consequence on the other, and in a highly networked battlespace governed by sensor signatures detected in microseconds and automated responses executed in seconds, where even the act of probing defensive boundaries is itself the ultimate decision that triggers cascading responses, the system answers with a comprehensive and devastating finality that compounds quickly across multiple domains, eliminates future options permanently through infrastructure destruction, and demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that assumptions about hesitation, civilian proximity creating sanctuary, or political restraint limiting military response are dangerous miscalculations when confronting a military doctrine where defense and retaliation begin simultaneously rather than sequentially, where detected intent matters more than actual impact in all circumstances, and where the very geographic compression that initially appears to offer tactical advantage to shore-based forces becomes a mechanism of their systematic dismantling within the span of a single hour.